based on your own experience and based on the journey of your activism, could I ask each one of you to tell me what has been the main shockwave that propelled you into activism? What was the moment, if I'm able to frame that moment, what was that moment that put you out there, where you basically, that moment that decided where you are now? So maybe if I can begin with Khawla.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so happy to be doing it again with Tarek. Um, so the moment, I'm not sure if I know the exact moment, but I think it was a series of events, like major events that all kind of intertwined into each other. I mean, the beginning was when I lived in Saudi Arabia, and that's where I saw really what it like brutal, violent oppression looks like. And living there and then coming back to Tunisia and seeing the difference and understanding we actually have so many privileges that we're not using. We have so much space that we don't still appreciate it enough. And I had, that moment of, oh my God, we actually can do more than what we're doing. Look at Saudi Arabia, look at where I was and how the queer community was treated there. So while we have the chance to do more, why not do it? And just a few months after that, the outing accident happened that you talked about, Lena. I mean, my face was on social media everywhere, thousands of threats, thousands of compliments at the same time. So it was like both the good and the bad. And it just made me realize, okay, it's not going to be easy, obviously. It started off, let's say, negative with all the backlash that I received back then. But also at the same time, I saw the positive. I saw that there was support in a way. And from there, and joining Mawjoudin, volunteering in the beginning with Mawjoudin, and getting that push from the people that are now my colleagues. And like slowly it started just, building up until it led me to now to working on our queer issues in the country. So I think that's how it went.
We're going to come back to that, Khawla. Thank you ever so much. Tarek.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Lena, and for the Asfari Institute, and for everybody who joined in. I would say there's two moments in my life that are particularly impactful. The first is what propelled me into activism, and the second, which completely flipped activism for me on its head. And the first was my coming out. In which I was very, very young, and it was a very tragic coming out. And it was at a time where people who were out were very, very few in the community, and I didn't know anybody else who was. And it just, what propelled me was to ensure that I could stand on my own 2 feet and be able to handle this. Because I realized very abruptly there are no support systems or mechanisms for queer people that are out on their own in this part of the world and in Lebanon. And one would argue that there still isn't enough, nearly enough right now. The second is actually the October 17th revolution, which I, regardless of what you think of it, and regardless of whether you think it worked or not, I personally believe is the first ever queer pride parade in the Arab world and in Lebanon, particularly because of the unprecedented visibility and participation of queer people under the banner of social and economic rights. So what activism was for me before that moment and what it inescapably became after were sort of the two bookends of my first sort of, if you want, era and doing this work. And ever since then, a whole new chapter has begun. And I feel like I'm a completely new activist and a new human being in this space.
I think what both of you described is very much what we mean when we say the personal is political. And thank you really for sharing this with us. I think it also allows us to get to know you more as activists and as human being and as people who are working for social justice. And with this, I'm going to hand over to Carmen, who's actually come here to continue the conversation.
You're going to give me your seat?
Yes, I'm giving you your seat.
Okay, so now that you started off on a personal note, I want to ask you a follow-up question. What have been some defining moments you think for the movement, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, that inspired LGBTQ activism in the region? What were some shocks that you think really pushed that movement forward?
Khawla, do you want to go ahead or want me?
Whatever you want.
Khawla first.
Okay. So I think, I mean, for the Tunisian context, it's just been one shock after the other since the revolution, but especially for the past 2 and 3 years, we've seen so many positive boosts, but at the same time, so many like downfalls that at the same time, we're kind of like jiggling in between. I think the positive sides I want to start with is that we saw the conversation about queer issues become more political and become more visible, and it became like a topic that we brought out and discussed publicly, like in households, in politicians' debates on national TV, during the votes for the presidency. It was a topic that was brought up by the Collib Commission, commissioned by the presidency as well. It was a topic that was discussed in the new parliament, newly elected parliament. So we started to see it everywhere. We didn't see like a positive outlook on it. It was a very ignorant discussion in a way, especially if you hear the opinions of all the politicians and decision makers who still do not understand the laws that exist, who still don't understand the impact of these laws on, on the ground, and yet they still discussed it. So at least it's there. At least it's something that we're talking about and recognizing that it's, it's an issue. It's something to be talked about. But at the same time, we were hit from the other side when we talk about COVID, when we talk about the revolution's 10-year anniversary and what happened after that, which is like just a few months ago. Obviously, COVID just proved what everyone knows by now. It just pushed us further down the pyramid of priorities. It just made all the inequalities and instability that we already had before, it made it all worse. And it was a shock, a very big shock for the community here in Tunisia, because we had to work together and we realized how lacking of resources and funding and capacity we are, and how much mental energy it had to take from us as activists to actually keep up with, having to rescue people, help people, shelter them, get them the medication, get the food, the basic necessities, that we've spent so many years talking about human rights that we forgot. Here's a pandemic that showed you before all of that, we cannot even afford food or shelter or anything, or work for that matter. And COVID proved that. And basically it was a slap to the face. And right as we're in that mess, we find the 10-year anniversary of the revolution, where we went out to the street, we got the backlash, police crackdown, activists are detained, people are being arrested left and right for no legitimate and legal reasons. And now we're not only having to respond to a pandemic that's not dying out anytime soon, especially in a country like Tunisia, but we're also having to deal with police forces and police syndicates and private political, groups that are attacking us and many other social movements as well, not just the queer movement. So I think we've experienced the good and the bad a lot in the past few years. And so that's basically the situation. Yeah,
it's basically it's a series of shocks. I mean, we're not supposed to be as many shocks. And Tarek, over to you. I mean, from the Lebanon vantage point, I know you're involved in the region, but from the Lebanon vantage point, what were some? Khawla talked about moments of politicization as positive shocks, and obviously, what were some setbacks?
It always is really interesting to see the parallels between what's happening across the region, even though we don't share a border, which will factor in a lot given our conversation later. So in Lebanon, paradoxically, we had the precursor of the revolution that sort of gave us a hint as to what's coming later, particularly because the visibility and the participation of queer individuals in Lebanon in the revolution did not come under the banner of queer rights. It didn't come under the banner of the decriminalization or removal of Article 534. It wasn't people were out there with placards saying, we want jobs, we want accountability, we want an end to corruption. It was not, so it was queer people for the revolution rather than the other way around. And that, if that wasn't a hint, later on with the economic crisis and the pandemic and the blast, all three incidents sort of solidified the inescapable reality that the world has changed and Lebanon with it, and we should also recognize that change. And some of the changes that have trickled down to our work that we thankfully were able to diagnose just in time and make a shift so that we are still relevant in the way we do our work. It's first of all, the decrease of the primacy of civil and political rights and the necessity of concentrating on social and economic rights as a venue towards achieving human rights in general. The idea that you can no longer separate the human rights framework from the development framework in achieving full rights for queer people and for people in general. And this necessitated also a reframing in terms of how we think about solving the public problem of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, you name it. And the central question has become not how do we fix institutions to become more LGBT inclusive. The question has now become how do we improve LGBTQ lives? And that opens up a whole array of possibilities, of partnerships, of new ways of intervening and engaging with the problem that were, obscured, whether intentionally or unintentionally. In fact, I would say that the concentrating on decriminalization, even though it's incredibly important, unintentionally obscured all of these other questions that we need to talk about. And so we've pivoted at Helem. Thankfully, we're small and nimble enough to pivot in time in order to work on 5 strategic priorities that we think are A, relevant, and B, doable no matter what's going on in the country and no matter what the state of our institutions are. And these include labor, housing, education, and access to healthcare. These are issues that have not yet been engaged with when it comes to queer communities, when it comes to marginalized communities in general in Lebanon. There's no data, there's no information, there's nobody actually working on them. And by working on them, I mean also changing the way we engage on these topics. So again, the question becomes not what can the labor rights movement do for me as a queer person. The question also becomes what can I do as a queer person to move the labor rights movement forward for everybody? And that approach is the approach that we've adopted for the past year and a half, and it has had wildly successful results that are evidence-based, that we could measure on how integrating into existing movements and even existing counter movements, not just the status quo in Lebanon, leads to long-term sustainable change. The other point that I would also add is that this approach also emancipated us from the tyranny of always having to, of seeing the legal framework in Lebanon as something that is fundamentally against us. True, the penal code does say same-sex sort of sexual acts against the order of nature are punishable by the law. So it criminalizes an act. But nowhere in the law does it say, okay, if we can't have sex, great, but it doesn't say we can't work. It doesn't say we can't have access to healthcare. It doesn't say we can't go to school. It doesn't say that we can't have housing and shelter. So we want those rights. And guess what? It's not international conventions that guarantees this, they do, but what guarantees this for me is the Lebanese constitution, clearly. No ifs or buts about it. So this shift, the shocks that Lebanon has gone through, paradoxically have hammered into at least my brain the inevitability of this shift. And it actually has a lot to a lot of connection to regional work and regional solidarity work moving forward, because it opens up an avenue where that kind of work actually can happen, as opposed to just talking about it.
Wonderful. I'll go out on a tangent, a really quick one. So it's not a major question, but I want like a quick reaction from the both of you. And what do you call this act of, we learn so fast? You've learned so fast. I mean, just the revolution alone can take time to process, right? The shock of the pandemic. And both of you as activists and the movements you're part of, you learned so much. One could say that, you know, would you say that's being resilient, being resistant, being adaptive? I mean, what would you talk about that reckoning and re-strategizing that you have to do so often and with so many big things, and still you rise above it? I mean, I love how you framed it, Todd. It makes complete sense to me. But for me, that is a process of, what is that? Is it leadership? Is it trust? Is it adaptability? What would you call it?
I'll go first on this one. Well, first of all, it's interesting you mentioned the word leadership, because I personally believe there's no such thing as a leader. And leadership is an activity that is communal, that people undertake in order to collectively solve a public problem. And that being said, to be honest with you, what we're trying to do now and what we're attempting to do, and failing and succeeding simultaneously, was brought upon by necessity, really. It was brought upon by this inevitability. I mean, what more do you want? There's a complete state, I would argue, not just state collapse in Lebanon, there's a complete nation collapse. We're both a weak state and a weak nation. And you sit there, and one of the only positive aspects to this is that it allows you to think about recreating and reframing and sort of the public narrative of where you happen to be in this world. And what is it that we're trying to do, and what hasn't worked before? And the community itself has imposed this reality. The data has made it very clear. We don't get a lot of people being arrested anymore, but the number of people asking for food security, for unemployment benefits, for access to healthcare, medication, emergency surgery, and for shelter, for safe housing, and the looming crisis that's going to hit our education sector sooner than we think, has skyrocketed exponentially. We're talking about, in some cases, 700% increase. I mean, you either adapt and you figure out a way to keep yourself relevant in your work on human rights without necessarily just becoming a humanitarian actor, because that doesn't really solve the problem. It's necessary. It's a necessary step to achieve human rights. We should never let that go, but you can't be stuck with it, because then it's a very slippery slope to remain just within the humanitarian sphere.
Wonderful. Khawla?
Yeah, thank you. I just also wanted to comment on the point of leadership, because as Tarek was saying, and many of it resonates too in the Tunisian context, is that the whole definition of leadership, it has to change. Very recently, like in the past year, my team and I have been working on a report that's basically all about the basics of the community, our income, our family, our schooling, education, healthcare, all of the things that we had no data on before this one report. And the results have been so shocking. Like Tarek was just explaining right now, it's like it faces you that really it's not just about violence and arrests and the traditional narrative that we're used to anymore. It's much deeper than that. The needs are much beyond what we're used to. And that in itself changes the whole definition of leadership, because unfortunately, we're in a region, and I think it's not just the case of Tunisia, we're in a region where really we rely on stardomship and being the star of a movement, being the leader of a movement, because of how many times we've been arrested or how many times we've been visible on a certain campaign on social media, and not because you're tackling real on the ground issues. So that whole definition, that whole image has to change in itself if we need to tackle those points that we were both mentioning. as to what it means, like our reaction, I don't think that we should romanticize it and say it's, you know, resilience or courage or any of that. For me, it's really just improvise, adapt, overcome over and over again. It's a continued process of having to, you know, survive more than anything. Because yeah, otherwise we wouldn't, like, quite literally. And yeah, so that's what we're doing, I think.
I love that. I'm gonna call it resistance just because I'm playing with the idea, but you can negate it. I have another question. So in particular, in the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, you talked about sharing so much, but not sharing, you know, geographical borders. So in particular, what do you think has given rise to a more regionally driven, transnational collaboration agenda? You talked about lack of data, maybe sharing data, framework. Specifically the last 2 3 years, what happened to strengthen, you know, these modes of or these networks? I mean, do you work together? Do you, outside of this, do you work together? Tell us about this,
Should I go ahead, Farah?
please.
Yes, we do work together, thankfully. Um, yeah, so I mean, not just Mawjoudin and Helem, but so many organizations in the region, we are all co-working together, whether it be it, you know, Tunisian organizations with other North African countries or Middle Eastern countries. And like the whole region is connected, and it's getting more and more connected, even though we don't necessarily face the same, you know, daily struggle, or we don't have the same history for the movement, but we still do work together. And I think the biggest, like in my opinion, the biggest reason, or like what enabled us to do all of this, is not just, you know, the sharing of data or the sharing of knowledge and expertise, but also the fact that we finally came into a place where we had the funding to do it on such a large level, and funding that is going for multi-country regional work. Because the knowledge is there, the willingness to produce knowledge is there. There are so many people with different expertise. There are activists that work on different really facets of the queer struggle in the whole region. But now that we have the ability to actually do it, to work together on advocacy projects, on lobbying projects, on awareness campaigns, and actually, even before that, to have this conversation, to talk together, to see what are the common points that we want to work on, and what is it not common and we should work on separately, to strategize together, to do all of this as a region. It has been enabled thanks to many things, and one of them that I really want to emphasize on is the funding, because we don't talk enough about it and about how important it is and how much more of it do we need. So yeah, that's, I think, one of the main reasons.
Tarek?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that the biggest problems we're facing today are global problems, and those that don't give a fig about borders. We're talking about climate change, cybercrime, you name it, and obviously the pandemic. And interestingly, human rights violations also ignore borders, and they don't even need to work through, you know, like reverse osmosis, where you need to have a common border in order for them to pass through. With the internet, with the increased connectivity and the way that the world functions now, an injustice somewhere and is an injustice everywhere. And this has been said multiple times before. So the biggest challenge in working regionally before was, first of all, operating under the mistaken assumption that many of our countries share the French or the British colonial legacy and the laws that they left behind, particularly the contra naturam laws, criminalizing sexual acts against the order of nature, whether it's Article 534 in Lebanon or Article 230 in Tunisia. Many other countries have their own version of this. But again, sequestering your interventions on decriminalization has led to stagnation in this process, largely because there are no regional bodies with which you can advocate with. I mean, who do we have? The Arab League or the Organization of Islamic Conference? These are like the homophobes and transphobes par excellence on the international stage.
I
And
can't even laugh behind this mask. Like, I can't,
well, it's
the pandemic.
comic. And furthermore, the UN, when it comes to human rights, and even when it comes to development, engages with countries bilaterally. Not so you, whether it's in Geneva or whether it's through the high-level political forum and your spotlight reports that you give in New York, it's not, there's no regional basis with which you can do work. That has changed recently because we reframed the way we think about this. And we decided, so if the UN and if there's no regional organizations that we can engage with on this issue, what is out there that we can engage on? And one of the things that we're working on is hate speech in the Arabic language, because we recognize that social media platforms are regional platforms because they operate vis-a-vis language. Obviously, in the Middle East and North Africa, Arabic is not the only language, and there should be specific care to always make sure that you include Amazigh, Kurdish, many other languages that exist and do not get or sort of get swept under the table because people just concentrate on Arabic. But the recognition that the private sector is a place that we need to engage with, whether it's through a carrot or a stick or both, has allowed for regional work to happen and in a tangible way. Who's to say that the way we decriminalize Article 534 in Lebanon is going to be similar to the way Khawla and everybody working on it in Tunisia is going to do it? It's not the same. We don't have the same government structures. We don't have the same cultural norms. We don't have the same history in dealing with with legislative change to begin with. Our civil societies are not the same. So it was very simplistic in the beginning to think that all you need to do is share information, data, and techniques and tactics, and then things will be fine. Those are great, and those allow, if you're lucky, for flashes of insight that could make all the difference. But it's only part of the work. There's so much else that we can talk about and try to reveal without just thinking always on legislation, on human rights in such a classic, such a sort of a very sort of binary way. And I believe that's what we're working on, and we're working on with other colleagues around the region, is really the first step in what is going to be really regional power building and community building and movement building. We don't know where it's going to head. We don't know where the glass ceiling is, but we do know that we finally found a place of intervention that is much more promising than when we were stuck for a very long time.
Wonderful. Let's talk about funding. My next question was funding. Funding is important to talk about. It's, you said, Khawla, multi-country funding, long-term. I would say there's also, I think, a rise in, sort of 3-year project, 5-year project, like funding available for that allows you to do work more regionally and maybe with a little bit of nafas, with some breath, right? The ability to think and to coordinate. But, donor funding is tricky. And how do you, both of you, interface with donors? Which donors? I mean, are you donor driven? How do you avoid that? I mean, let's talk a little bit about this. Khawla, how do you interface with donors in the context of Tunisia? What do you say to people that, this is a donor-driven agenda, this is a Western idea, there will be no activism if there wasn't this money? I mean, how has that evolved, especially in the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, to the statement that there would be no activism if it wasn't for the donors, I say you're right, to start with, because that is true. Without the donors, without the funding that we receive, we wouldn't be able to, pay the staff, do the research, the community work, provide the actual safe building where community members can come. So, in Tunisia, we have this proverb. It says, which is basically, let's not hide away from the truth. That, we without that funding, we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do. That being said, I think a conversation about the history of the movement beyond the donors can make it easier, for people who are willing to listen, to understand that it's not just, the typical Western agenda and Zionist plot that's coming to destroy the Arab region. Like, many people still believe that. So to explain to them that no, like the laws that exist are laws from French colonialism. The history of the movement, it didn't start like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, just a few decades ago. No, especially when we talk about the Tunisian case, we've been through so many different societies, so many different languages. And if you study like all of them, you will see there's an appearance of the queer community in some way, shape, or form, obviously different names, different labels, that it appears. So we're not new to this society. It's just that now we have the ability to advocate, we have the language to speak about our issues, and we have the funding to do it. So the funding is just a way to enable and give power to a community that already existed but didn't have a voice before. It did not create the community from scratch. We weren't born when that Western funding came to the country or the region. And as to how we deal with funding, so Mawjoudin itself is a fairly young organization. We're only 5 years old. So many of our projects, like the projects that are finishing just now, are actually the first projects that we did. So they're 5-year projects that we just started 5 years ago, and they're getting done now. Some others are more short term, and some are just newly starting with a new strategy, focusing on newer issues. Like I was explaining earlier. So when we started in Mawjoudin, we had, our bold fixed lines. For example, no Zionist funding, no direct American funding. We do not get any funding directly from embassies. We only work with either funding that comes from other international organizations or, specific bureaus, that kind of things. Through time, we realized that, for example, working with embassies would be very, very necessary, especially for advocacy and lobbying when we talk the UN level, the regional level, and not getting that funding from them or not partnering with them can be very harmful for us as an organization and as a movement. So that strategy is changing. It is shifting into being more open to embassies. Still doesn't change that, we go case by case, we study the source. Obviously, we don't want to be working with organizations or parties that, defy the human rights values that we are working on, or with governments that, are not queer friendly or don't respect human rights in general. And we try to look at it from a holistic point of view, not just, queer friendly governments. That's like one of the reasons that we always mention when we talk about for US funding. Yes, the US government might look like it's very LGBT friendly and has all these beautiful laws, but let's look at other movements, how, the Black Lives Matter movement, how they treat immigrants, all of that. So when we think about it, it's very intersectional. We don't just, get the money wherever it comes from. Another thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to funding is the emergency funding and how much we need it and how unavailable it is. Again, COVID proved it even more. We've been new before, but it proved it more that we really need that emergency funding because, most funders, I'm not sure if the participants are aware of how, the whole dynamic works, is that they would prefer to fund like a long-term thing, a long-term project to see, outcome, to see a strategy, and all of that. So emergency funding is not very available. You cannot just call up a certain person or organization or embassy and say, we need this amount of money, for example, to provide shelter for a certain group of queer people or to help some refugees or anything like that. Most of the time that doesn't work. So there are very limited sources for that emergency funding. And with time, we're needing it even more. Because as I said, we're in the situation where we need that money unexpectedly all the time. And it puts us in situations where we need to rely on our own, emergency funds that we kind of got from fundraising or from other organizations or from other projects and stuff like that, which puts us as organizations in very vulnerable positions. So this is one of the missions that we're on right now, to change the whole narrative and the conversation with the donors themselves and the funders, to talk to them about these issues. Like, we no longer only need the awareness, for example, health and legal intervention and all these different emergent things that come unexpectedly and to be.
I think Khawla just broke. We can't hear you. Do you want? Sorry. Yes, now you're back. Sorry. Yeah, you were being super articulate. Go ahead, please.
I don't know where did it cut. What was I saying?
Educate donors about what you need. That it's not just, for example, typical projects around awareness. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that's basically it. Is that I think our role right now is that we have to talk to the funders and, you know, have a conversation with them in order to change the whole way that the funding trickles to Tunisia, to our organizations, and to the region. Because that's the only way it's going to change. Funders are not on the ground with us. They don't know the issues that we are facing and our like immediate needs. So it's our job to basically deliver that.
Thank you. I love this because you put your own strategy sort of into words, like you improvise, you learn, you adapt, you make a strategy, but then you go back, you think about it case by case. So I love that. Tarek, your experience, I mean, how do you navigate?
Well, in Lebanon, the experience has been slightly different. You know, Helem is 20 years old. The meeting that took place to form it was in 2001. Even though we've been around for 20 years, LGBT activism has been around far before that, you know, far earlier. From, you know, during the Civil War in the 1970s, there were activists on the ground. So you don't need funding in order to be an activist. However, this begs the question that what is it going to take in order to solve this problem? And what is it going to take in order to do it sustainably and in the long run? It's going to take a combination of both centralized and decentralized solutions. So NGOs are only a part of the process, are only part of the solution. And expecting NGOs to do all of the work is setting them up to fail, because they're not built in a way that can maneuver in order to solve such a complex systemic problem, because the problem has multiple angles and it needs multiple different sorts of interventions. And all of the different stakeholders in this system need to be engaged simultaneously. That includes, you know, allies, it includes the international community, it includes the diplomatic community, it includes government, it includes the NGO sector, the private sector, media, you name it. I'm not going to go through all of them. And in order for you to do the work, you must have resources, and you have to get resources in places that don't compromise your integrity, and definitely not to be donor driven. That's why data matters. That's why you're going to have to be able to argue that the resources that you're asking for are being used because this is where they need to go, rather than where you think they need to go based on your own understanding of the situation, on your own gut. Academia has a role to play in solving this problem as well. So that being said, the idea that, first of all, you getting funding, particularly foreign funding, automatically makes you donor-driven or automatically makes you part of the so-called gay international is a really myopic and very reductive view of us as people and as individuals and of the movement itself. It's as if we sell our soul to the devil by securing necessary resources in order to allow advocacy to work. I'm going to give you a small example. If you're going to work on housing in Lebanon, you need to understand what is the extent of the housing problem, given this is a country that has, you know, dismal infrastructure when it comes to housing policies to begin with for everybody, not just for marginalized communities. Do you actually think that you're going to be able to go around and just sort of meet homeless queer people, ask them for their information, ask them for all of the everything that they have, and then just go? And again, what are you giving in return? You know?
Like we treat refugees.
Exactly. And not to mention that, you know, I'm not talking about interview fatigue. I'm talking about you can't engage in human rights work without also providing people with their needs. That's where development comes in. And so what we do is that we set the strategy and then we look for donors whose values, whose understanding of the situation mirrors our own. And that doesn't make you donor driven. It's the exact opposite. The real problem, I think, is this sort of incredibly binary and very simplistic view of just because you speak to somebody automatically makes you a traitor and automatically makes you somebody who has sold out or, you know, has chosen, you know, financial resources over, you know, engaging with the actual problem, when in fact those two overlap more often than not. And my question back to people that, you know, fill out these accusations and throw them out is, what's more important to you? Is it solving this problem or is it exonerating your own outrage? What is it? And if you think that any of this is going to be easy, if you think that any of these engagements are going to be cookie cutter and it's going to be uncompromising, fight to the finish, you're sadly mistaken. This work is one indignity after another, because you're mobilizing different facets of a system that don't want to talk to one another. And there's no such thing as a broken system. The system is set up precisely to deliver the results it's delivering and precisely to benefit people in power. And people in power like it the way that it is. Even your allies, even straight allies, cis allies are benefiting from the system unconsciously because, for example, you're not competing with them as a queer person for particular jobs. I, as a queer person growing up, never dreamt of being the CEO or the director or the leader or any of that. My horizon was cut short because of the experience that I had. And that automatically makes other people more advantaged than me, even when they are the strongest supporters of this movement. So my question is, if not us, who's going to make the necessary interventions to shift this system? You know, they're not going to do it. We're going to have to do it. And we can't just do it with our own people. We have to do it with them. And that's going to take confrontation. That's going to take a lot of patience, a lot of guts, and a lot of pain moving forward. And you need resources in order to do it. So I would say judge people by what they do, not what they think they do, or not what you think they ought to do. And let that be the starting point in which we can have a discussion about, you know, that, you know, the more interesting question is, why can't we have access to governmental funding? Why do we have a government that can't fund its own people to do the work that they need to do and support it in you know, following the Lebanese constitution and in protecting all citizens and non-citizens on Lebanese soil? So I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful. I love that. What is most important here? What is it that we're trying to do? I mean, that is the question. What is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to solve the problem, or is there a tangent that we need to be aware of? Final question, and I just want to say that you're both such great speakers. I don't want it to end. But the last question is, you know, today, going back to a little bit of our sort of academic scholarly hat, today, who are the authors of the public narratives in your countries and in the region? And what are they saying? What are they saying, these authors of public narratives, and who are they saying it to? I mean, are we speaking to our own governments? Are we asking for an implementation of particular frameworks? Are we speaking to each other? Are we speaking to what Tarek said, these local problems are also global? So who are the authors of the narratives? What are they saying, and to whom are they saying it to? That's my final question today. Khawla.
All right. Who are the authors? I wish there was a simple answer to this question, but the reality is that it looks like a very complicated network of authors that are not all going in the same direction, if that makes sense. So if you look at Tunisia today, you see a cluster of a very conservative driven movement, whether politically or within youth groups or academics and researchers, is just, you know, a big and vocal group that's working just as hard as the other organizations and youth groups and academics and researchers on the other end, just as hard, just as funded, and we're going in parallel lines basically. So we find ourselves in a situation where there's not much communication, which is very unfortunate. The doors for conversations are not very open, whether be it with the civil society, with the government, or civil society within itself, and civil society with the people on the ground. Talking from my perspective as a person working with an organization, it's we find that most of the time, inevitably and somehow, we find ourselves talking to the people that share the same opinions with us. We find ourselves talking to, you know, our familiar audience, which is not good. It's not going to help the movement advance. And we, as much as we try, you know, to avoid that and find new people, new parties to talk to, it seems like we're always coming back to the same point where that's the comfort zone. These are the people that will actually listen. And it is like, it has some sort of improvement, but it's not what's needed. It's not the radical change that we're looking for. So we're trying to make that conversation, you know, bigger and broader. We're trying to talk more with government, with the parties of the government that are willing to talk, although we are also still facing that very violent backlash, especially now. The political situation in Tunisia is that it's just a slippery slope for the past few months, like the last 5 months. It's just become worse and worse. And we see this division where the politicians and the political parties themselves, they're not even talking to each other. We're clearly divided. We see the old regime is coming back up. Ben Ali's dictatorship regime, it's coming back up, very powerful with new leaders. And we see the conservative post-revolution parties going even stronger. They're not communicating. And that doesn't give us space to communicate with either of them, because each is rejecting us in their own way. So what we're trying to do is that communicate with the institutions, not the people, not because they're going to change inevitably, because they're just, you know, it's Tunisia. Every few years, a new explosion, a new government, new president, and you have to start from zero. So we try to communicate with the institutions to see the people working inside the ministries, working inside coalitions, working inside, these unions and groups, because these are the people that will remain there. And these are the people that actually do the real on the ground work and have the knowledge and are not just, faces of the system, of the institutions. So we try to talk to these people as much as possible and to make sure that we as queer people are present in these conversations, especially now with the new outlook that we've been talking about today. If we want to talk about our new needs, about shelter, about the income deficit that we're facing, if we want to talk about our healthcare needs, all of that, we cannot just continue to do it by talking to our familiar audience. Our familiar audience is the audience that needs the help or cannot help. So we have to put ourselves out there and engage in these difficult conversations. And sometimes we even have to, not let, the queer identity, if that makes sense, be the number one priority, as controversial as that may sound. Like, we need to go into a room and be like, I'm not here as a queer person, I'm here as a Tunisian citizen who's talking to you about this specific issues. So, and then we'll see how that can, be adapted and how can that help my community. Because otherwise the conversation will not happen. And if the conversation doesn't happen, then we're not going to go anywhere. And whether we like it or not, these people, these parties, these groups are like very much shaping the narrative of the Tunisian society, and they're very influential. And as much as I'd like to trust the new generation that's growing up and, you know, see how open-minded and like versatile they are, I know that they could be influenced as well. And the current system, the current government, the current generation that's in power is not dying out anytime soon. So we have to do what we have to do for now to influence the narrative as much as possible.
I love this. I love this idea about there, you know, so many authors, even competing narratives, and this idea about being present sometimes in unfamiliar spaces and unfamiliar audiences. Like just by being there, you can start influencing those institutions and not just talk to people. And I love that. Thank you, Khawla. Tarek, public narratives.
Yeah, I would add and say we've always been authors. We were just writing in the margins. And now, with the shocks that you've talked about in the beginning of today's discussion, is an opportunity for us to move from the margins and become and start writing the actual script and become co-authors with everybody else that's also writing it. Because, you know, chaos is a ladder that we too can climb. And there, with all of what's going on in Lebanon, particularly, chinks in the armor, the shifts that have happened have allowed us to push in places that we were unable to reach before and frankly unwelcome. And we found ourselves to be able to maneuver and gain territory in places that have historically rejected our presence. And so this, because particularly the revolution, again, regardless of how you feel about it, did at least show us that there are multiple new emerging existing national narratives in Lebanon outside of the narratives of the political parties and the sectarian narratives and. How they will emerge, how whether some will stick or not, it depends on us, really. But this isn't just a right, it's a responsibility. And figuring out what kind of narrative and what exactly do you want to be? Do you want to be the LGBTQ community in and of itself, sequestered, or do you want to join what's happening around you and build power that way? I am more of a fan of the latter rather than the former. I'm more of a fan of integrating queer people into the existing movements for rather than just, you know, sort of doing our own thing. We've done our own thing for 20 years. I believe it's time for a change. The other issue that I would address when it comes to the issue of who gets to say what is that what's really important is people speaking and representing themselves. And the LGBT issue, if you want, is, I believe, ready and has been ready to graduate into a serious political issue and file in Lebanon that is inexorably linked to the future of the country and its future livelihood. That the question of freedoms, personal freedoms, public freedoms, is a really important question for us to centralize as we think about where is Lebanon going forward and what do we have that remains amidst all of the destruction that we've inherited. And so that's part of the reason why I stayed and why I'm very happy that I stayed, and because I still believe that there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of things, a lot of infrastructure to build in order to give us, you know, a shot in influencing what's to come.
I love this conversation, Anjad. I can't tell you, both of you. I mean, I can sit and talk about this for many, many hours, Anjad. And what you're saying, yani, Anjad, thank you. I don't want to be monopolizing the conversation. I want to open up, you know, questions because I feel I can hog you for at least the evening. So if we have questions, can you put them on the chat or raise your hand? Bana, would you like to ask yours out loud?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks very much to Khawla and Tarek. I really enjoyed this very much. And thank you to Carmen and Lena and the Aswari Institute for organizing. So I wrote the question. I guess I'll just state it. Some of the so again, thank you for all the work you're doing, and I really appreciate this integration into working on other political issues in order to feed that sort of a feedback loop in which your groups, the LGBTQ activists, they gain the trust of the community at large, and then it becomes a much more productive relationship. So there have been two things that have been popping in my mind a lot among activist circles in my experience in the Lebanese community, and I don't know to what extent they're replicated in the Tunisian community. One of them has to do with a lot of infighting among different members of the group, and this has to do, with internalizing the dominant discourse. So there's a critique of people within your group or a particular argument, and then we internalize it. We end up fighting with each other, and we've seen this often, and that has caused a lot of detriment to a lot of different groups. So that's one question. Another question is, it also has to do with how our societies have been divided, consciously, extremely divided, not just by in Lebanon, not just according to sectarian divisions, also in terms of class divisions. And so one other problem that I've seen is the failure of several activist groups in talking to people from different socioeconomic classes, or breaking the socioeconomic divide. So I was wondering if your groups have had experiences in addressing these kinds of problems, these two specific problems, that and maybe other groups can learn from these kinds of experiences. So thank you again for everything.
Thank you, Bana. I think I can answer both questions in one answer. First of all, I personally have a lot of compassion and understanding for the activists working on gender and sexuality in Lebanon, particularly those that were involved in Helem's early years, because it was the first time in the history of the region that diverse LGBTIQ plus activists came together in one space, and no one had any idea what to expect. We didn't have a blueprint. We didn't know how to manage disagreement. We didn't know what the disagreements that would emerge. Helem has a very unique history, and a very painful history, because it was one of the places where people discovered that there's misogyny in the LGBT community. Who knew? And then there's transphobia in the LGBT community. Who knew? And then there's xenophobia in the LGBT community. Who knew? When many LGBTQ Syrians came down and became part of our community and part of our lives in 2011, and integrating that wasn't easy. So I didn't expect anybody to know how to handle all of this. And obviously many groups fragmented, got back together again, fragmented again. My go-to is always to differentiate between conflict and confrontation. One of the things that happened is that people chose to, or were geared towards conflict rather than confrontation. The difference is that confrontation creates spaces between people when conflict destroys them. And particularly slinging manure on social media doesn't help the process further. Now, the way I can tell you of how we've begun to think about this and how we've begun to address it is to, first of all, to think about spaces and the deliberate lack of non-commercial public spaces for queer people in the entire region, not just in Lebanon. And when we're talking about spaces, we're talking about the necessity to create a holding environment that can withstand this much diversity. Diversity and intersectionality are these buzzwords that people throw around. They're really difficult. They are a massive responsibility, because you're bringing in everybody's backgrounds, you're bringing in everybody's difference in political opinion, and you're bringing in everybody's pain and trauma, and you're putting them in one place. And of course, people are gonna butt heads, because there hasn't been, or there has been too many avenues with which to correctly, or at least partially, channel all of this outrage and all of this rage. And second, and this is where I think it's really important, when you do have all of these people together, you are mistaken if you think your role as an activist is to direct and manage them. The idea is to give the work back. The idea is to mobilize people not to do what you think is right, but to mobilize them to face reality. And that is something that we are really trying hard to do, and it is incredibly difficult to do in a place like Helem and other places that have, community, sort of community spaces. And so Helem's issue is that we've actually had a lot of problems convincing people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds to join. and to lend their own resources and time and energy into this movement. One additional thing I might add, and something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is that we also should be critical of the of sort of the pressure and the impetus with which we need to come together under a shared identity. That's not necessarily the end-all, win-all scenario. We can come together under shared strategy and under shared values, and not centralize identity all of the time, because there's multiple different ways with which to do the group. And if we're just all gonna be, it's obviously amazing to work together as LGBT activists, particularly defensively. When you've come for one of us, we come for all of us. But when it comes to actually engaging and creating, we might have different views on how the work is done, and that's fine. It's fine. Actually, one of the best experiences that I've had ever since I started doing this work is engaging with other non-LGBTQ activists that have the same values and vision that I do, particularly those working on labor reform, those working on housing, those working on issues that affect all of us, not just issues that affect the LGBT community, in which we already collaborate with siblings in this fight. So a lot of really fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves, and honestly to really be compassionate and understand why people got personal and got internalized. We are a community at siege, and it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of healing, and a lot of truth in order to get out of it. And it's going to take, and it leapfrogs. It doesn't happen gradually. It happens, and then there's silence for a few years, and then there's an explosion. That's my experience. That's my experience with it. Thanks for the question.
Amjad, thank you. I'm just mindful of the time because Asfari,
okay.
No, Khawla, and then there's a question from Fahad Jamaluddin on schools. If you could check that and answer in 5 minutes, because the director of Asfari and the woman of the house is right here, and she has to give closing remarks. So please, really quickly, if you can.
Okay, so I don't want to repeat any of what Tarek said. He basically covered everything, but just like a few points that I wanted to mention when we talk about the community itself, not just activists, like community members. I think one of the main things that they need, like in my experience, so we do not fall into that inter-community violence, is to make sure that there is exclusive spaces for these subgroups of the community as well. To understand that trans women, for example, will need their own exclusive spaces, that cis women who are queer will need their own exclusive spaces, etc., etc. So although we are one marginalized community, we still do not share everything. So the existence of those spaces, whatever they are and in whatever form they are, it's very necessary for them to feel heard and to feel like they're connected to certain people, and get the space basically to let out that frustration and that pressure and everything in a safe space to avoid that violence. Within activists, other than everything that has been said, I think another thing we should remind ourselves of is that we do not bear the responsibility of everyone's actions or intentions or like their chosen paths and strategies. Because I think for a very long time, activists and organizations that they represented have like held the issues of the community and the internalized violence and all of it like a huge weight on their shoulders. Like it was like one big like responsibility to handle on your own, when in reality that's not the case. You're one individual, you represent one organization, and if the strategies don't match, if the opinions are not the same, if you choose different paths, it's not your responsibility to assume what the others will experience. And although that's hard to hear, it is the truth, and it keeps us grounded and stable and have the mental energy to continue doing the work that we do. As for the question, like the last question that was asked, it's basically asking about educational settings, schools, if there are any changes, if we were able to capture from a school, that's a level.
Like an organizational level, changes in schools, yeah.
What does it take for us to support children and teachers to thrive? Okay, so already saying the word children in this context in Tunisia is a big red flag to start with. No, we're not there yet. And it's very dangerous territory. What we try to do is that, for example, when we work on certain campaigns or research or anything, is that we try to vulgarize the language to make it as simple as possible so that if it were to reach, let's say, teenagers or young adults or people, still in school, it would be understandable and accessible and a way for them to reach out to us. But specifically, I'm here talking about children, minors. For us to go in a formal educational setting, like for example, go to their schools or something like that, it's impossible right now as queer organizations. The most that we can do is social media, and thankfully we have social media and all the teenagers are on social media, so that's basically the only way to reach them, to educate them, and to make sure they know that there are safe spaces for the ones growing up right now. Yeah.
Very quickly, in agreement, I think the problem is mostly parents. We as Helem, there's no way that we're going to be allowed on campuses of schools, but I think we need to work with teachers. That is a point of intervention that really needs to happen. Helem gets regular sort of messages and emails with sort of audio files of kids recording what their teachers are saying in class. And it is deeply problematic, deeply damaging what's going on in Lebanese schools. And I'm not talking about public schools, I'm talking about the big wig private schools that claim to have Title IX, claim to have a liberal education, all of that. So that is definitely something that we can start working on, particularly on issues of bullying, particularly on issues of violence, and on conversion therapy. There's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you both so much for agreeing that I do this. Amjad, it's been my honor. I'm going to give it to the woman of the house, Aspari director, the lady herself, to close, please.
Thank you guys ever so much. I mean, first of all, thank you so much to my dear, dear friend, Carmen. Let me just tell you a little bit what happened. Internet and electricity and everything went down in Carmen's house. So she came here actually to be able to be with us. So I'm incredibly thankful. Carmen, without you, we wouldn't have that discussion. So thank you so much, Falan. And Khawla and Tarek, that's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. I mean, all the way from your personal journey to your reflections, to your inner thoughts, to your passion and everything that you have to give. So thank you ever so much. This has been a very, very special conversation, and of course I can tell you now, one of many to come. So we're hoping to have you and have your colleagues as much as possible, because these are the conversations that we need to have and to continue having. I just want to thank all my dear colleagues at the Asfara Institute, who are working so much to make sure that we started to have and that we're having these feminist conversations once a week. Next week, for those of you who are with us, next week our conversation is going to start about focusing on dissecting, tearing apart the funding ecosystem in the MENA region. Where is the money? Where does it come from? Where does it go? Who gets in? Who is left out? Why? And how can we change that? So tune in for this conversation, which will start next week. Thank you all. And the session is recorded. It's going to be available online on the Asfari Institute website and social media. Guys, thank you for your time. That was really, thank you for your candid thoughts and your inner thoughts. This has been very, very, very enriching for all of us. Shukran kteer, and see you all hopefully next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.